Well, good morning, Madam Speaker, and thank you very much for your kind introduction. And I am very honored today to have the opportunity and privilege to take part in this debate and to introduce to this House Bill C21 at its second reading. Madam Speaker, Bill C21, an act to amend certain acts and to make certain consequential amendments, is a historic and important step forward for Canada in creating a safer country. Madam Speaker, this legislation proposes to introduce some of the strongest gun control measures in our country's history. It represents the culmination of many years of work and strong advocacy from the victims of gun crimes in this country. We have listened to those victims. We've listened to police chiefs across the country who have urged successive governments to bring in stronger measures, recognizing that community safety and gun control is a factor of community safety and a necessary legislative requirement in order to keep our communities safe. As Dr. Nadia Ahmed, the co-chair of the Doctors for Protection from Guns, has said about this bill, this is a comprehensive bill that, when enacted, will save lives. Madam Speaker, Canada is generally a very safe country, and Canadians take great pride, but they are concerned, legitimately concerned, about the threats posed by firearm-related crime in their communities. Madam Speaker, it's important to begin with the recognition and acknowledgement that gun ownership in Canada is not a right, it is a privilege. It's a privilege earned by gun owners who obey our laws, who purchase their guns legally, use them responsibly, store them securely. And it is through the strict adherence to our laws, regulations, and restrictions that Canadians earn the privilege of firearm ownership. And I want to acknowledge that the overwhelming majority of those firearm owners are, in fact, responsible and abide by our laws. But we also know that far too often, firearms can fall into the wrong hands or be present in dangerous circumstances. Madam Speaker, as a former police officer and police chief, I have far too many times been required to go to the scene of firearm tragedies where young people and innocent citizens have been gunned down in the streets, and where the impact of firearm violence impacts not only those victims, but their families and their communities. Last summer, Madam Speaker, I went to a community in Toronto that had already experienced 22 violent gun incidents in just in the month of July. And what that meant in that community is every child knew someone who had been the victim of a gun crime. That generational trauma demands a response, an appropriate response from all Canadians. Madam Speaker, I've also had the unfortunate duty to attend funerals for police officers and for citizens who've been killed with these guns. And those are the things that I think should deepen all of our resolve to take action. We have listened to the strong advocacy of the victims of the École Polytechnique in Nova Scotia, at the mosque in Quebec, and at tragedies throughout the country. We have also witnessed with horror the use of some of these weapons in mass shootings around the world. And Madam Speaker, we have taken action. As you'll recall, last May 1st, our government, by order in council, prohibited over 1,500 weapons. With Bill C21 introduced today, we are taking actions to complete that prohibition. We have, through the legislation, established the conditions which are necessary to secure and set controls for the newly prohibited firearms. Under this legislation, all of those in possession of such newly prohibited firearms will be required to acquire a license to possess the weapon. The firearm will have to be registered as a prohibited weapon. There will be no grandfathering as was previously done, but rather we are imposing through this legislation strict prohibitions on the sale, transfer, and transport of this weapon, and we are imposing complete prohibitions on their use. The use of these newly prohibited weapons will be a criminal offense. We are also imposing strict conditions on the storage of these weapons, rendering these newly prohibited firearms legally unusable as a firearm. Madam Speaker, we have relied on the advice of law enforcement and our various officials across the country to determine the best way to manage safely these weapons that are prevalent in our society. But I also want to be clear, there's nothing actually in this legislation that speaks of a buyback program, but we also believe that those Canadians who purchase these guns legally, that we have now prohibited, need to be treated fairly. And we are imposing appropriate and necessary prohibitions on their sale and their use and restrictions on their storage. But we also intend to offer the people who purchase these guns legally an opportunity to surrender them and to be fairly compensated for them. Madam Speaker, this bill does much more than just complete the prohibition. We have also looked very carefully in this legislation at all of the ways in which criminals gain access to guns. And as I've said, we have seen a very concerning increase in gun violence in cities and communities right across this country. It manifests itself in different ways, but we know that in almost every circumstance, criminals get their guns from one of three ways. They are either smuggled across our borders from the United States, they are stolen from lawful gun owners or for gun retailers, or they're criminally diverted from those who purchase them legally and then sell them illegally. Madam Speaker, in consultation with law enforcement, we have looked at all of the ways in which criminals gain access to guns, and we have taken strong action in Bill C21 to close off that supply of guns. And for example, the concern of guns that are coming in from across the border. We've heard very many times about concern from law enforcement, but also from communities across the country about the proliferation of firearms, particularly handguns, that are smuggled in from the United States. Madam Speaker, I recently had a conversation with my counterpart in the United States, and we are committed to establishing a bilateral task force on both sides of our country for law enforcement to work more collaboratively together to help prevent the importation of these firearms. And in Bill C21, we are also taking strong action to increase the penalty for gun smuggling and to provide law enforcement and our border service officers with both the resources and access to the data they need to be effective in identifying the source of these guns and for cutting off that supply and to deal more effectively to deter and to detect and to prosecute those individuals and organizations that are responsible for smuggling these guns into our country. But Madam Speaker, let us also be clear that smuggling is not the only way. And quite often we hear from gun retailers and the gun lobby in this country that we should only look at somebody else's guns, not theirs. But the reality, unfortunately, in this country, Madam Speaker, that in many parts of the country, crime guns are not just smuggled across the border. And in fact, I think it's important to listen to some of the police chiefs. And for example, the chief of Saskatoon has recently said that guns in his community, crime guns in his community, are not being smuggled across the border, but rather are being stolen from legal gun owners. We've also heard from the chief in Regina, who very clearly said that again, the guns in his community are not coming across the border, but either are guns that are legally owned, obtained through theft or through straw purchase. And the chief in Edmonton, who also opined that only 5 to 10% of the crime guns in his community in the city of Edmonton are actually smuggled across the border, and the rest come from legal gun owners, from theft and straw purchasing. And so, Madam Speaker, it's important in this legislation that we address both those sources of supply as well. And that's why, Madam Speaker, we're introducing in this legislation strict new restrictions on the storage of handguns in this country that will require all handgun owners to store their weapons more securely in a safer vault that will be prescribed and described in the regulations of this legislation. And it will also require gun retailers to store their weapons when on display and in storage more securely to prevent the theft. And Madam Speaker, I would just highlight just an example. A couple of years ago, 2 young girls and 9 Torontonians were injured in a terrible and tragic gun incident. And the firearm in that case was stolen some 3 months before from a gun shop in Saskatoon. And over 3 months, it made its way into Toronto and was used in a horrific crime. And so keeping those guns out of our community is an important element of Bill C21. And finally, Madam Speaker, we also deal with the source of supply through criminal diversion. We've seen a number of examples where individuals have purchased a large number of handguns, made an attempt to disguise their origin by filing off the serial numbers and then selling them for an enormous profit to the criminal market and to the gangs that commit these violent acts in our communities. those crimes, in order to be detected and therefore deterred, we need to ensure that law enforcement has access to the resources and the data that they need to properly trace those weapons. And that's why, Madam Speaker, first of all, we've in this legislation provided law enforcement with that access. But we're also making significant investments. And yesterday, I advised this House that through our investments in British Columbia, for example, we've just opened up a brand new forensic firearms laboratory that'll assist law enforcement in determining the origin of these weapons and to hold those individuals who purchase them legally and sell them illegally to account. Madam Speaker, we also know that in addition to crime guns that get into the hands of criminals, there are also circumstances where the presence of a firearm, which may have been legally obtained, in certain potentially dangerous situations can lead to tragedy. We see it in incidents of domestic violence and intimate partner violence, where a firearm may be legally acquired and be in a home, but when the circumstances of that home change so that it becomes a place of violence and threat and coercion, Madam Speaker, the presence of a firearm in those circumstances can lead to deadly consequences. And so although the police currently have some limited authority to remove firearms from those circumstances, we know, Madam Speaker, that in many, many cases of domestic and intimate partner violence, the police are not aware of the presence of a firearm, or even the crime is reported to them. And so through this legislation, we are empowering others, empowering victims, those who support them, legal aid clinics, other people in our society, to be able to take effective action through what we call extreme risk laws to remove those firearms from that potentially dangerous situation. Similarly, Madam Speaker, in a situation where an individual may become suicidal or is emotionally disturbed, where the presence of a firearm in that situation could lead to a deadly outcome. And Madam Speaker, we are empowering doctors, family members, clergymen, elders in a community to take effective action to remove firearms, utilizing the provisions of this legislation to remove firearms from that potentially deadly and dangerous situation. And finally, Madam Speaker, it also applies to those who engage in acts of hatred and extremism online, and where there is evidence, and we have seen this in a number of tragic incidents right in this country, where individuals have given indication of their deadly intent online, and where that information is available, we are now empowering those who become aware of it to take action, to remove firearms from that deadly situation and help keep people safe. And Madam Speaker, I want to advise this House that in every jurisdiction in the United States, 19 states have implemented extreme risk laws, or what are also referred to as red flag laws. And in those states, Madam Speaker, we have seen that strong evidence that these measures save lives. And Madam Speaker, that is our intent with this legislation. This legislation is not intended in any way to infringe upon the legitimate use of firearms for hunting or sport shooting purposes. It is, Madam Speaker, first and foremost, a public safety bill. It aims to keep firearms out of the hands of those who would commit violent crimes with them, and to remove firearms from situations that can become dangerous and therefore be made deadly by the presence of a firearm. And Madam Speaker, that is the intent of this legislation. We are taking some additional measures within this legislation. We, for example, have listened to law enforcement, which for over 30 years has been urging the Government of Canada to take action to prohibit what are often referred to as replica firearms. Madam Speaker, these are devices which are designed and appear absolutely indistinguishable from dangerous firearms. And the police have urged governments to take action because they have seen these devices are often used in crime. They have been used to hurt people, and they present an overwhelming and impossible challenge for law enforcement when confronted with individuals with these devices, and it has in many circumstances led to potentially tragic consequences. And so, Madam Speaker, in this legislation, we are also introducing legislation to listening to the law enforcement to prohibit those devices. And if I may be clear, this isn't about BB guns and paint guns and pellet guns that people use recreationally. It's about devices that are designed to appear as exact replicas of dangerous firearms. And it is that exact appearance which really creates the danger around these devices, and so we're taking action. We're also taking action to strengthen our provisions with respect to large capacity magazines. And Madam Speaker, I have been to far too many shootings in my city of Toronto where we've seen, whereas years ago, when someone perhaps may have discharged a revolver, there would be 2 or 3 shots fired. But now with dangerous semi-automatic handguns and large capacity magazines, it can lead to situations where we have literally dozens and dozens of rounds that have been discharged, putting far more innocent people at risk. And so we have seen that those devices often are modified and changed to allow for a higher capacity, and we are taking action to prevent that. We're closing a loophole with respect to the importation of information, and we're making other consequential amendments to this legislation, all intended to keep communities safe. And Madam Speaker, I also want to be clear that companion to this important legislation, we've also made significant investments, first of all, in law enforcement. We saw several years ago that a previous government cut enormous amounts of funding from the police, eliminating RCMP officers and border service officers, weakening our controls at the border, and compromising our ability to deal effectively with organized crime. And Madam Speaker, we've been reinvesting in policing and in border services to restore Canada's capacity to secure our borders and to keep our communities safe. And Madam Speaker, for example, we've made over $214 million available even to municipal and Indigenous police services, because we know that they do important work in dealing with guns and gangs in their community and reducing gun violence. And so we've made those investments in policing, and those investments are important. But Madam Speaker, they're not the only investments that are necessary in order to keep our communities safe. And that's why, Madam Speaker, we're also investing in communities. And through our fall economic statement, we're making $250 million over the next 5 years available to community organizations that, Madam Speaker, do extraordinary work in our communities and working with young people and helping to change the social conditions that give rise to crime and violence in our community. Madam Speaker, I believe this is a comprehensive approach to gun safety in this country. It's always extraordinary to me that some people are afraid to talk about guns when we're talking about gun violence. But in my experience, Madam Speaker, countries that have strong and appropriate gun control are safer countries. And we have also seen that in those countries that have weak gun laws, as have been opposed by some in this House, those countries experience far too often the tragedy of gun violence. Madam Speaker, I would, if I may repeat, that in this country, firearm ownership is a privilege and not a right. That makes us fundamentally different from countries like the United States, where the right to bear arms is a constitutionally protected right. It is not in Canada. Canada, like many other very sensible countries, has taken the appropriate step of banning firearms that have no place in our society. They're not designed for hunting, and they're not designed for sport. They're designed basically for soldiers to hunt other soldiers, to kill people, Madam Speaker, and tragically, that's what they've been used for. That's why we've prohibited them. And through the actions of this bill, we are taking strong measures to ensure that these firearms cannot be ever legally used in this country. We believe that these provisions are appropriate, necessary, will be effective, and that they are fair, because we acknowledge as well that those who purchased those now prohibited firearms did so legally. And now that we've prohibited them, we want to ensure that they can never be used to commit a violent crime at any time in this country. Madam Speaker, we've drawn a bright line in this legislation. We are not a country where people arm themselves to defend themselves against each other. We don't carry guns in this country for self-protection. We rely on the law. The rule of law, peace, order, and good government is a strongly held Canadian value. And we do not arm our citizens, as they do in some other countries, to protect themselves and to use for self-defense. Firearms in this country, Madam Speaker, are only appropriate for hunting and for sports shooting purposes. And there is nothing in this legislation that in any way infringes upon those activities in this country. Notwithstanding, some will try to make the case, but frankly, it's a false case. It's based on a false assumption. And the assumption is, first of all firearms in this country, all firearms represent a danger. They are offensive weapons by their very definition, and therefore we regulate them in Canada. We regulate them very strictly. Additionally, some of those firearms are very dangerous, and so we appropriately add additional restrictions, and we restrict those weapons, handguns, for example. And finally, there are some weapons that frankly have no place in a society for which firearms can only be used for hunting and sport purposes. Firearms that were designed for combat, that are tactical weapons, that used to be marketed as assault weapons before those weapons began to be prohibited by countries like New Zealand, Australia, the United Kingdom, and even in the United States for a decade, these weapons were prohibited. And so, Madam Speaker, we are doing the right thing and taking the appropriate action to keep Canadians safe. It builds upon the effective measures that we brought forward in Bill C21, which we are in the process of fully implementing over the next few months. And we believe that coupled together with our investments, both pieces of legislation will help fulfill our promise to Canadians that we will do everything necessary to strengthen gun control in this country and to keep Canadians safe. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.